I own this company now, Father. Nathan's voice echoed throughout the plush conference room, causing Richard Montgomery to flinch. You can't. It's impossible. Richard barely managed to squeeze out, feeling the ground slipping out from under his feet. 15 years ago, you abandoned your deaf son in an orphanage, calling me a useless burden. Today, I bought your entire empire. How does it feel to fall from grace, Father? Nathan's face remained unmoving as he looked into the eyes of the man who had once abandoned him. Richard looked around helplessly. All of his former colleagues stood silently watching the scene of retribution unfold. Nathan stepped forward. You know what's ironic? You said a deaf kid would never amount to anything in life. Now look at which one of us lost everything. Nathan's voice was clear and confident, the result of years of intensive speech therapy and rigorous training. Snow fell relentlessly on the windows of the maternity ward at the prestigious Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City. Richard Montgomery, the 39-year-old owner of Montgomery Construction, one of the largest construction companies on the East Coast, stood motionless, staring out the glass of the intensive care unit. There were no tears in his eyes, only emptiness and the anger that ate at him from the inside like poison. Mr. Montgomery, I'm so sorry. Dr. Fisher, an older man with gray hair and tired eyes, put his hand on Richard's shoulder. We did everything we could. The complications were too severe. Your wife, she didn't make it. Richard pulled away from the touch, unable to take his eyes off the small bundle the nurse held in her arms. His son, the child that had just been born at the cost of his Sarah's life. And the child? The words came out sharp, almost accusing. Dr. Fisher sighed. Your son is alive, but he has a hearing problem. We need to run more tests, but preliminary results point to deafness. It may be congenital. Richard finally turned, his gaze colder than the January snow outside. Deaf? My son is deaf. His voice shook with shock and anger. And this is what Sarah died for? Mr. Montgomery, I understand that you are going through unbearable pain right now, but you don't understand, Richard growled, his voice echoing down the hospital corridor. That kid, he took everything from me. The nurse, a young woman with kind eyes, approached them holding the newborn. Mr. Montgomery, would you like to hold your son? Richard recoiled as if struck. I don't want to see him, ever. But sir, he is your blood. Look, he is so like you. Take him away. Richard's voice was icy. I will not raise a disabled person. Dr. Fisher was stunned. Mr. Montgomery, deafness is not a death sentence. Modern technology, special schools. My decision is final, Richard snapped. I have neither the time nor the desire to deal with a child who will never be a fully fledged person. I will be filing paperwork to renounce parental rights. The nurse held the baby close, her eyes filling with tears. How can you? He just lost his mother. And I lost my wife, Richard replied, already turning to leave. Let me know when Sarah's body can be collected for burial. With these words, Richard Montgomery walked out of the hospital, leaving his newborn son behind without even giving him a name. Victor Harris, the chief financial officer of Montgomery Construction and Richard's closest friend, was waiting for him in a black Lincoln outside the hospital. When he saw the look on Richard's face, he knew right away. Sarah? Victor asked quietly. She's gone, Richard replied, climbing into the back seat. Let's go to the office. I have work to do. The office? Richard, you just lost your wife. And what do you suggest? Sit and cry? It won't change anything. Victor looked in the rearview mirror. And the child? What child? Richard replied coldly, looking out the window at the falling snow. I don't have a child. A few days later, after Sarah's funeral, Richard Montgomery, accompanied by Victor, arrived at Sunshine Home, a state institution for children without parental care, located in Queens. Mrs. Rodriguez, a middle-aged woman with kind brown eyes and prematurely gray hair, met them at the entrance. Mr. Montgomery, I have received the paperwork, but I must make sure that you fully understand the consequences of your decision, she said, trying to catch Richard's eye. Giving up parental rights is a permanent decision. Richard sighed impatiently. I know exactly what I'm doing, Mrs. Rodriguez. Where do I sign? Mrs. Rodriguez did not budge. You must see your son first. It is a must. Richard's face twisted in irritation, but he followed the woman down the hallway of the orphanage without a word. In a small room painted pale yellow, his son lay in a wooden crib, wrapped in a blue blanket. The baby was surprisingly calm for a newborn, his blue eyes the exact copy of Sarah's, wide and intently studying the world around him. "He's a very beautiful child," Mrs. Rodriguez said softly, "and despite his deafness, he's perfectly healthy. The doctors say that with the right approach—" "Where are the documents?" Richard interrupted her. Mrs. Rodriguez sighed and pulled out a folder. "Right here. But before you sign, I want you to hold him, just once." "It's not required by law," Richard insisted. "No, not necessarily. But I ask you as a human being, hold your son before you give him up forever." Victor, who had been standing silently by the door, intervened. "Richard, maybe we should—" "Shut up," Richard snapped. But after a moment's hesitation, he held out his hands. Mrs. Rodriguez carefully placed the baby in his father's arms. The moment Richard felt the baby's weight, something in his heart trembled. The baby looked at him through Sarah's eyes, and for a second Richard saw the reflection of the woman he loved in them. But then the image of Sarah dying on the operating table eclipsed everything else. Anger and pain flooded his soul again. "Take him," he said, practically shoving the child back into Mrs. Rodriguez's arms. The baby, feeling the sudden movement, burst into tears. His tiny hands reached out to Richard, as if begging him not to leave him. "Mr. Montgomery, this baby is not a burden. He's a gift," Mrs. Rodriguez said, cradling the crying baby. "He needs you." "A deaf child will never amount to anything in life," Richard replied coldly, snatching a pen from his pocket. "He will only be a burden. I have no need of him." He quickly signed the documents and handed them to Mrs. Rodriguez. "You can't be that cruel." There was undisguised indignation in her voice. Richard pulled the child's hand away when he reached for it again and turned to Mrs. Rodriguez. "I'm not here to be lectured. I've already made my decision. You just need to do your job," he said firmly before walking away. Mrs. Rodriguez knelt down, holding the crying baby close. "Don't cry, baby. I'll take care of you," she whispered, but her heart was unbearably sore for the child who had just been rejected. Outside, Richard got into the car and signaled the driver to drive off. Victor, already waiting in the car, looked at him in the rearview mirror. "Are you okay, Richard?" Victor asked in a neutral tone. "There is nothing more to say," Richard replied coldly. "That is a thing of the past." Victor smiled slightly, nodded, and said nothing more. The car moved off, leaving behind the shelter, immersed in the silence and cold of a winter day. And outside the orphanage, the little boy continued to cry, his blue eyes fixed on the door as if he was waiting for his father to return. But the door did not open, and the man he had seen for only a few moments in his life did not return. Mrs. Rodriguez sighed and carefully picked up the child and carried him into the family room, where the fireplace was burning, providing some warmth on this cold day. "You'll find a home here now, baby," she said, though she knew the child couldn't hear her. "Together we'll get through this." As she spoke these words, a name for the little boy, with eyes the color of the summer sky, was already forming in her head. "I'll name you Nathan," she whispered, looking into the baby's eyes. "Nathan means gift, and you are a gift, even if your father doesn't see it." The sunny shelter became a place where Nathan was forced to learn how to live and cope. It had never felt like a real home to him. A small room with 6 beds, old clothes, and simple food could not fill the void in his heart. As the years passed, Nathan grew up a lonely child, suffering from the curious glances and cruel taunts of other children. His deafness led to bullying, especially from Tyler, a boy 2 years older, who established an informal hierarchy among the children at the orphanage. "Look, there goes the mute!" Tyler shouted one spring morning as 10-year-old Nathan walked into the dining room. "He can't talk. He's like a robot." The other children laughed, and Nathan, although he could not clearly hear the taunts, felt the contempt through their gestures and looks. He simply lowered his head and sat in the far corner of the dining room, avoiding the eyes of others. "Hey, mute, did you hear what I said?" Tyler walked up to Nathan's desk, followed by his 2 loyal followers. "Oh yeah, you can't hear anything." He slapped his forehead dramatically, causing another burst of laughter from the other kids. Nathan didn't react, clutching the spoon in his hand. His eyes reflected deep pain, but he had learned not to show it. Reacting only spurred the bullying. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had just entered the dining room, immediately assessed the situation. "Tyler, stop this right now!" Her voice was stern and did not allow for arguments. "If you continue, you will be cleaning the entire kitchen for a week." Tyler shrugged, trying to hide his mocking smile, and left with his group. Mrs. Rodriguez walked up to Nathan, put her hand on his shoulder, and said softly, "Don't worry, Nathan. Don't pay attention to them. You're stronger than you think." Nathan nodded slightly, but his eyes remained downcast. He couldn't say thank you, but Mrs. Rodriguez's warm gesture eased his pain a little. In his free time, Nathan would usually seek out a quiet corner of the shelter's courtyard, where there was an old oak tree and a battered wooden bench. There he would spend hours with sheets of paper and colored pencils that Mrs. Rodriguez would obtain from the small donations that periodically came into the shelter. Nathan loved to draw because only with a pencil in his hand could he express his feelings and thoughts. One day he created a large drawing of a family under a bright sun, a picture of his dreams. A father, mother, and a smiling child holding hands. But as soon as he finished, Tyler and his followers appeared. "Look at what the mute is drawing. It must be some kind of nonsense." Tyler snatched the drawing from Nathan's hands and held it up for everyone to see. There was laughter, and without thinking, Tyler tore the drawing in half. Nathan jumped up, trying to save his work, but to no avail. Tyler continued to tear the paper into tiny pieces, and one of his friends grabbed a bucket of dirty water that was used to wash the bench and poured it on Nathan. "Pathetic and useless," Tyler snapped before leaving with his group. Nathan remained sitting on the ground, shivering in his wet clothes. But he didn't cry. Instead, he began to pick up the pieces of his torn drawing, his small, shaking hands desperately trying to salvage the remains of his shattered dream. Mrs. Rodriguez watched from a distance. She clenched her fist to contain her anger, knowing that if she intervened now, Nathan would become an even bigger target for ridicule. She waited until Tyler and his group were out of sight before she walked over to Nathan, kneeling down next to him. "Nathan, are you okay?" she asked, even though she knew he couldn't hear her words. Nathan nodded without looking up, continuing to collect the pieces of paper. Although it was useless, the water had turned them into a shapeless mass. Mrs. Rodriguez placed her hand on his shoulder, silently comforting him. "I will find a way to protect you better," she whispered, making a promise to herself. In the days that followed, Nathan began to spend more time in his room, avoiding the other children. He continued to draw, but now he did so on small pieces of paper that he could easily hide. Despite the solitude, he began to develop an inner strength, silently refusing to let ridicule dampen his passion for art. One night when everyone was asleep, Nathan sat by the small window in his bedroom, his face illuminated by the moonlight. He was painting a new picture, a boy standing alone in the middle of the forest, but illuminated by a ray of light from afar, a symbol of hope. Nathan never stopped dreaming of the day he could escape this isolation and find a place where he could belong. But in his heart, the pain of his father's abandonment remained an open wound. The next morning, the children began teasing Nathan again, but this time Mrs. Rodriguez was prepared. "Tyler, I already warned you. You're going to have to clean the entire dining room today," she said firmly. Tyler pressed his lips together but didn't dare object. Mrs. Rodriguez walked up to Nathan and gently placed her hand on his shoulder. "Don't worry, Nathan. We'll get through this together." Although Nathan's eyes were blank, Mrs. Rodriguez knew that in the boy's heart, these moments of support were a straw he could cling to in a sea of loneliness. After the other children left, Mrs. Rodriguez sat down next to Nathan. "You know, Nathan, you're special. You're so much more special than you think. One day you're going to prove to them that you're not just that deaf boy. You're going to do something no one expects." Nathan looked at her, and a small glimmer of hope appeared in his eyes, small but clear. He had never thought that he could achieve anything great, but the words of hope, though unspoken, found a response in his soul. In a plush conference room on the top floor of the Montgomery Tower in Midtown Manhattan, Richard Montgomery sat at the head of the table, his cold gaze sweeping over the room. In the 15 years since he abandoned his son, he had become an even more successful businessman, his company a construction empire known up and down the East Coast. Everywhere people spoke of him with a mixture of admiration and fear. Richard was known not only for his business achievements, but also for his tough, uncompromising leadership style, his willingness to sacrifice anything for the sake of profit. "I want revenue to double in the next quarter," Richard said with unquestionable authority. "Victor, do you have a specific plan?" Victor Harris, now the company's vice president and Richard's closest advisor, nodded, a glint of self-confidence in his eyes. "Of course, Richard. I've arranged for a new supplier to sign a contract. The materials are 30% cheaper, although they don't meet all the quality standards. But don't worry, I've already made sure the inspectors turn a blind eye to it." Richard frowned, not from worry, but from admiration for Victor's cunning. "Are you sure this won't have negative consequences?" "I'm quite sure," Victor smiled with almost unbelievable self-confidence. "If there are problems, I'll take full responsibility. I have connections in the city council." Richard nodded, not wanting to go into detail. Profit was always the most important thing for him, and Victor had proven time and again that he could achieve results without worrying too much about methods. The other staff in the room exchanged worried glances, but no one dared to object. They knew that Richard would not accept advice that was contrary to his financial interests. Within a few months, the company began to experience its first problems. 3 buildings that Montgomery Construction had built in Brooklyn developed serious structural defects due to the use of substandard materials. The local news picked up the story, and shareholders began to worry. In his private office, Richard angrily threw the inspection report across the room. "Victor, explain to me what's going on," he growled, his eyes full of fury. Victor walked in, trying to remain calm. "Richard, this is just a temporary problem. I have already contacted the crisis management team, and we will resolve this before it gets out of hand." Richard was not satisfied. "Temporary difficulties? Do you have any idea what that does to the company's reputation? Our stock has dropped 15% in 1 week." Victor smiled, though his smile was strained. "Richard, I assure you, everything will be fine. Trust me, as always." Richard looked at him for a long time, beginning to doubt his partner, but his pride would not allow him to admit that he could have been wrong to trust him with so much power. In the end, he simply waved his hand, signaling Victor to leave. Meanwhile, in other departments, employees increasingly discussed the risky decisions of management, especially regarding the deals organized by Victor. Michael Dawson, an engineer who had worked for the company for more than a decade, was talking with his colleague Jennifer in their small office. "Don't you think the company is heading in the wrong direction?" Michael asked in a concerned tone. Jennifer nodded, lowering her voice. "Of course. But who would dare say anything to Richard? He trusts Victor blindly. If anyone spoke, he would lose his job instantly." Michael shook his head. "It's unfortunate. This company used to be a symbol of quality and reliability. Now it's all falling apart because of the greed of a few people." The situation at Montgomery Construction was becoming increasingly tense. Despite the impressive appearance of the main office, the financial reports were becoming increasingly depressing. Richard was constantly calling emergency meetings, but instead of taking responsibility, he blamed everyone around him. Even his most loyal employees began to lose confidence in him. One day, Victor walked into the office with his usual self-confident smile, but this time Richard couldn't help himself. "You said everything would be fine. Now explain to me why we lost 2 more major contracts and why the prosecutor's office opened an investigation." Victor shrugged as if it were no big deal. "Richard, I think you should calm down. All my decisions were dictated by the interests of the company. Perhaps the problem is the way you manage." Richard was stunned. This was the first time Victor had dared to speak to him in such a tone. Rage engulfed him. "Get out of my office, now!" he shouted, his voice shaking with anger. Victor left, but not without throwing a mocking smile. At that moment, Richard realized that Victor was no longer the loyal assistant he knew. But he could not act immediately, because Victor had too much information and connections that could harm the company even more. That night, Richard was alone in his spacious office. The light from his desk lamp reflected off the glass of his disappointing financial reports. He picked up a glass of expensive scotch and drank it down, feeling only bitterness and disappointment. From the picture window, he looked out at the illuminated Manhattan skyline at night, which had once been the symbol of his success. Now, Richard felt everything was falling apart, but his pride did not allow him to accept responsibility. He told himself that all this was temporary, that he would find a way out. But deep down, for the first time in years, he felt real fear. He was afraid of losing not only the company, but everything he had built, including the reputation he valued so much. The image of Richard sitting motionless in his chair, his eyes red with fatigue, reflected the inner collapse of a man blinded by his own unbridled ambition. He began to understand that Victor was not the only problem. He himself, with his pride and greed, was the main cause of his impending collapse. As the night deepened, the lights of Richard's opulent Hamptons mansion continued to burn, casting eerie shadows across the immaculate lawn. Richard returned home after a harrowing day, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor of the foyer. Martha, the housekeeper who had looked after Richard's home for nearly 2 decades, nodded respectfully when she saw her master, but quickly disappeared when she saw the tension on his face. Richard tossed his jacket casually onto an antique chair and headed for the bar, pouring himself another glass of whiskey. This mansion, which cost millions of dollars and was the envy of society, had never seemed like a home to him. It was just another display of his status, another proof of his success. But today, for the first time in a long time, Richard felt the suffocating emptiness of this place. Expensive furniture, works of art, antiques. All this seemed a meaningless accumulation of material symbols, unable to fill the emptiness in his soul. With a glass in his hand, Richard slowly walked up the stairs to the second floor and then toward a door at the end of the hallway, a door he rarely opened. It was the room where Sarah's personal belongings and a few memorable photographs from their life together were kept. The wooden door creaked as Richard pushed it open. The scent of Sarah's delicate perfume, somehow preserved in the enclosed space, hitting his nose, triggering a flurry of memories. In the semi-darkness of the room, lit only by the moonlight coming through the loosely drawn curtains, Richard saw family photographs, old jewelry, and boxes of Sarah's things neatly stacked on the shelves. He noticed a wedding photograph in a silver frame. He and Sarah, young and happy, looking forward to the future. Next to it was another photograph, taken a few weeks before Sarah died, when she was in the last months of pregnancy. Her smile, full of love and expectation, now seemed a bitter reminder of what had been lost. Richard picked up the photo of Sarah, feeling it weigh a ton. The memories of her came back, squeezing his chest in a vice of pain. "Sarah," he whispered, running his finger over the image of her face. "Why did you leave me?" Then his gaze fell on a small envelope lying at the bottom of the drawer. He recognized Sarah's handwriting on it. With trembling hands, Richard pulled out the envelope. Inside was a letter dated the day of her death and a small black and white ultrasound photograph. Richard began to read. "Dearest Richard, if you are reading this, then what I feared so much has happened. The doctors warned me of the risks, but I could not give up our child. This is my choice and I accept its consequences. Please, if I am gone, do not blame our baby. He is innocent. Love each other, be a family. This is my last wish. You will be a wonderful father, I know it, and our baby will be a reminder of our love. Always yours, Sarah." Sarah's words were like a knife stab. All these years, Richard blamed the child, abandoned him, violated the last will of the woman he loved. "What have I done?" His voice was barely audible in the silence of the room. The memories of the day he had left his son at the orphanage came flooding back. He remembered the small hands reaching out to him, the sky-blue eyes so like Sarah's, and his cold refusal. "It's you! You're the cause of everything!" Richard swept the photographs off the table in a fit of anger. The sound of breaking glass echoed throughout the empty house. Rage took hold of him, uncontrollable and wild. He began to wreck the room, ripping photographs from their frames, throwing memories across the floor, shattering them into pieces. Martha, hearing the noise, hurried upstairs. "Mr. Montgomery, are you all right?" she called out from the door. "Go away," Richard barked with such force that Martha stepped back, frightened. She did not dare enter, remaining in the hallway, worried but powerless to do anything. Richard continued his destructive rampage until he finally picked up a photograph of Sarah holding an ultrasound scan of their unborn child. In a fit of blind rage, he tore it in half. "Because of you! All because of you," he shouted. But he himself did not understand to whom he was addressing these words. To the child, to fate, or to himself. But then the room went silent. Richard fell to his knees in the rubble of shattered memories, his shoulders shaking. For the first time in years, he felt completely alone. He had no one to share his burden, he had no family, and he had lost the wife who had once been his greatest support. All that was left was an emptiness that could never be filled, and a regret burning inside. Martha waited for a moment, then decided to open the door. She saw Richard sitting in the chaos, his head down, holding a torn photograph in his hands. His gaze was empty, not at all like that of the powerful man she had known for many years. She walked in carefully and began to pick up some of the photo fragments from the floor. "Mr. Montgomery, perhaps you should rest a little," Martha said in a soft but caring tone. Richard didn't answer. He just looked up at her, and there was a weariness in his eyes that she had never seen before. "Do you think I'm a terrible person, Martha?" he asked unexpectedly. Martha paused, considering her answer. "I don't think you're a terrible person, sir, but you've made mistakes, and maybe now is the time to correct them." Richard picked up one of the fragments of the photograph, showing Sarah's eyes. "Undo it? How can I undo what I've done? I abandoned my son, my only child. It's unforgivable." "It's never too late to try, sir," Martha replied quietly. "Start small. Richard tried to put the torn photograph back together, as if that could fix the past. But the crack remained, a reminder that nothing would ever go back to how it was. He lay on the floor staring at the ceiling, his mind filled with images of the son he had never known, the child with Sarah's eyes now growing up somewhere without a father. A cold wind whistled through the cracks in the window, touching his face, but Richard paid no attention to it. He closed his eyes, listening to the sound of silence that enveloped his huge, empty house. It was not just the silence of the night, but the silence of a life without love and forgiveness. The luxurious mansion that was once a symbol of success and power was now just an empty shell, filled with ghosts of the past and regrets that he could not escape. Richard lay there, his gaze lost and staring at the ceiling, as if he was waiting for something or someone to pull him out of the abyss of loneliness he found himself in. But nothing happened. He was left alone with the pain and the irreparable mistakes of the past. Meanwhile, Nathan grew up in an orphanage, where loneliness and rejection became constant companions of his life. But day after day, he learned to confront reality. Unlike other children, Nathan did not complain or protest. He endured in silence, hiding his pain and creating his own world with the help of his drawings. By the age of 15, Nathan had grown into a handsome young man with piercing blue eyes and a determined gaze. Although he was still unable to hear, he had learned to read lips and could communicate through sign language, which he had learned through special classes organized by Mrs. Rodriguez. One autumn morning, Nathan was sitting in the corner of the orphanage common room as usual. An old piece of canvas was spread out in front of him, and he was enthusiastically painting with acrylic paints given to him by Mr. Johnson, the caretaker of the orphanage, who had noticed his talent. Tyler, who was still Nathan's main source of trouble, walked past with two friends. "Look what Mute's doing again." "Another mess," Tyler said loud enough for the other kids to hear and laugh. Nathan didn't react, continuing to focus on his painting, a vivid depiction of the New York cityscape he had only seen in magazine photographs. Tyler, annoyed by the lack of response, stepped closer and snatched one of Nathan's brushes. "You don't need that much, do you?" he said mockingly, then snapped the brush in half before throwing it on the floor. Nathan looked up, meeting Tyler's gaze. But instead of showing anger or fear, he calmly leaned down, picked up the broken brush, set it aside, and continued his work with the other. This calmness made Tyler even more irritated. "You think you're so special? Let's see what you do with this." He grabbed the canvas with Nathan's drawing, and one of his friends knocked over a glass of dirty brush water right on the work, washing the bright colors into shapeless spots. Nathan stood up, watching his days of work disappear before his eyes. There was pain in his eyes, but he showed no sign of weakness. At that moment, a commanding voice came from the door. "What's going on here? Tyler, get out of here right now." Mr. Johnson, a tall man with gray hair and a stern look, quickly approached the group. Tyler and his friends, taken by surprise, quickly retreated, leaving Nathan alone with his destroyed work. Mr. Johnson leaned over, carefully examining the ruined canvas and scattered art supplies. "Are you okay, Nathan?" he asked, even though he knew the boy wouldn't hear his words. Nathan didn't answer, just nodded slightly, lowering his head. He began to gather his things, his hands shaking slightly from suppressed emotions. Mr. Johnson sighed and placed his hand on Nathan's shoulder. "You are very special, Nathan. Not everyone can express their soul through art like you can. Don't let those who don't understand your talent lead you astray." Nathan looked up, and there was a spark in his eyes, a faint but distinct spark of hope. Mr. Johnson smiled and stood up. "Wait here a minute," he said as he walked away. A few minutes later, he returned with a small box in his hands. "I think you might find this useful," he said, handing the box to Nathan. Opening it, the young man found a set of professional brushes, tubes of oil paints, and a new, high-quality sketchbook. Although these were not the most expensive materials, for Nathan it was the most valuable gift he had ever received. Nathan accepted the box, his hands shaking with excitement. He lowered his head in gratitude, unable to express his feelings in words. Instead, he opened his sketchbook and began drawing right there on the floor, his lines confident and determined. Mr. Johnson sat down next to him, watching silently. After a while, he said, "My son was an artist too. He started out like you, with little drawings full of hope. Keep drawing, Nathan. I believe you will achieve incredible things." In the days that followed, Nathan spent almost all of his free time drawing. From small sketches on paper, he moved on to work on canvases that Mr. Johnson brought him. Each of his strokes contained intense emotion. Not only his pain, but his resilience and his belief in a better future. One day, a woman named Miss Sullivan, an art teacher from a prestigious art school in New York, came to the Sunny Shelter. She ran a charity program to find talent among children in difficult life situations. When she saw Nathan's works hanging in the shelter's hallway, she could not hide her sincere admiration. "These paintings are amazing. Who painted them?" "Mrs. Sullivan asked, looking closely at a particularly striking work depicting dawn over a city skyline. Mr. Johnson pointed to Nathan, who was drawing in the corner of the common room, completely immersed in his art. "This young man, his name is Nathan. He is deaf, but as you can see, this does not stop him from creating beautiful things." Miss Sullivan came over and sat next to Nathan. "You're a real artist," she said, knowing he couldn't hear her words but hoping he would understand her admiration. "I've never seen anyone express such deep emotion through color and form." Nathan looked up at Miss Sullivan, his eyes wide with surprise. He had never expected to receive a compliment from a stranger, especially from someone from the outside world. There was also a hint of uncertainty in his gaze. Years of rejection and ridicule had left him doubtful of any kindness. Miss Sullivan noticed his hesitation and smiled. She took a small notebook from her bag and wrote, "I want to help you develop your talent. Could you participate in our school's art project?" Nathan read the note and his eyes widened in surprise. He picked up a pencil and wrote hesitantly, "Are you sure? I can't speak or hear." Ms. Sullivan smiled even wider and wrote, "Art needs no words. It speaks for itself, and your art screams talent." Nathan was in a whirlwind of emotions, a mixture of hope, fear, and disbelief. But Miss Sullivan's look and Mr. Johnson's supportive nod made him realize that this might be his chance. He nodded slowly in acceptance of the offer, and Miss Sullivan shook his hand enthusiastically. "Great. We'll start next week. I believe your talent deserves to be seen by the world." The image of Nathan in front of the canvas, his eyes full of determination, was a turning point in his life. He no longer painted simply to escape reality. His art now became a bridge to a world that had always seemed out of reach. In his office on the top floor of the Montgomery Tower, Richard stood by the picture window, watching the endless stream of traffic far below. This was New York, the city he had once considered his own. Now he felt like the city was turning its back on him. Bad news about the company continued to pour in. The New York Times published a scathing article about Montgomery Construction's practices, including the use of substandard materials and possible bribes to inspectors. Federal prosecutors began investigating, and important partners were breaking contracts one by one. A knock on the door brought Richard out of his gloomy thoughts. "Come in," he said in a heavy voice. Victor walked in with a folder in his hands, but in contrast to his usual self-confidence, his face expressed undisguised anxiety. "Richard, I'm afraid the situation is critical," he said, placing the folder on the table. Richard quickly flipped through the documents. The financial report was completely in red, which meant catastrophic losses. "What does this mean?" he asked, although he understood the numbers perfectly well. "How did you let this happen? You said everything would stabilize." Victor tried to remain calm. "Richard, I did everything I could, but the shareholders lost confidence. The scandal with the buildings in Brooklyn was the last straw. I warned that we needed a more aggressive plan of action to protect the company's image." Richard threw the folder back on the table with force. "You were responsible for these decisions. Don't blame me." Victor grinned, and his eyes took on an open challenge. "Don't forget, Richard, that it was you who approved all the plans. It was you who gave the green light to use cheap materials. I was only following your orders. If you want to find someone to blame, start with yourself." Victor's words were like a punch to the gut. Richard took a step forward, overcome by the urge to hit his former friend and confidant. But he stopped, feeling a sense of helplessness wash over him. "Get out of here!" he shouted, his voice shaking with rage. Victor simply shrugged and walked out without another word. When the door closed, Richard collapsed back into his chair, covering his face with his hands. He no longer had anyone to trust or rely on. His closest ally was a traitor, ready to profit from his downfall. A week later, the Montgomery construction scandal flared up again. The Wall Street Journal published a detailed investigation into corruption schemes associated with the company. Prosecutors raided the offices, and several mid-level managers were detained for questioning. The shareholders called an emergency meeting, demanding an immediate explanation from management. But Richard, clinging to the last of his pride, refused to attend. Outside the company's headquarters, one of the senior shareholders, William Preston, addressed a group of journalists. Richard Montgomery has brought this company to ruin with his irresponsibility and greed. We can no longer trust him. The board has voted unanimously to replace him. From his office, Richard watched the performance on his television screen. He gritted his teeth, his eyes red from lack of sleep and stress. He felt like the whole world was against him. But deep down, Richard knew that no one was to blame but himself. The decisions dictated by his boundless ambition, his blind faith in Victor, and his inordinate pride had led to this moment of absolute collapse. The next day, Richard received formal notice from the board of directors. He was fired as CEO and required to leave the company immediately. It was a crushing blow for a man accustomed to absolute power. Martha, his housekeeper, met him when he returned home in the middle of the day, pale and haggard. "Mr. Montgomery, I've made you some tea," she said with concern in her voice. Richard said nothing. He silently walked up the stairs to his office and closed the door behind him. The luxurious estate no longer brought him joy or a sense of power. Everyone around him was just lifeless objects, reflecting his own inner devastation. In the study, Richard saw the family photographs that Martha had carefully restored after his recent destructive rage. The fragments had been glued back together, but the cracks remained visible, as did the scars on his soul. He closed his eyes and memories of the past came flooding back. Sarah. And the son he had left behind. Where was that boy now? What had he become? Did he even remember his father? A few days later, things got even worse. Richard received word that Victor had disappeared, taking with him a large sum of money from the company's reserve fund. It was the final blow for Montgomery Construction. The stock plunged to historic lows. The last loyal employees resigned, and the headquarters building stood empty, its elegant logo now a symbol of corporate collapse. A cold autumn wind cut through Richard as he stood in front of his former building, looking out at the dark windows and empty lobby. A gust of wind blew away his scarf, but Richard made no attempt to catch it. He stood motionless, his eyes blank, knowing that he had lost everything: his company, his reputation, and most importantly, his soul. As the sun began to set, Richard did not return to his mansion in the Hamptons. Instead, he drove to the northern part of Brooklyn, to where he had once lived in a modest apartment before he became a powerful businessman. He parked his car on the curb and simply sat, watching ordinary people hurrying home after a day of work, to their families, to those who waited for them and loved them. Richard stayed there for a long time, as if waiting for redemption or enlightenment. But nothing happened. There was only himself, alone with the mistakes that had destroyed everything he had once had, and with the emptiness he had created with his own hands. It was a clear but cold morning, typical of New York in early November. The Montgomery Construction shareholders' boardroom was filled to capacity. An air of tension and anticipation hung in the air like a heavy fog. Richard Montgomery walked into the room, a place that had once been his second home. A vast room with floor-to-ceiling windows and a long, polished table where he had spent countless hours making decisions that changed lives and shaped the city's skyline. Now the space felt alien and hostile. The looks that had once expressed respect and even fear were now cold and judgmental. Richard adjusted his tie, trying to maintain the last of his dignity. Inside, he was overcome with anxiety, but outwardly he tried to appear as always, confident and unwavering. Victor, to Richard's surprise, was also present, standing against the wall with his usual smug smile. Rumor had it that he had managed to make a deal with the prosecutor's office, turning in some of the company's managers in exchange for his own immunity. "Is everyone present?" Richard asked in a stern tone, trying to take control of the situation. One of the shareholders, an older man named Henry Ellison, responded, "Yes, everyone is here, but we are waiting for a new CEO to take over the company from now on." Richard frowned. "A new CEO? Who dares to claim my position?" Before anyone could respond, the massive doors of the hall swung open and all eyes turned to the entrance. A young man in an impeccably tailored dark blue suit walked slowly into the room. His posture and confident gait spoke of a man accustomed to power and respect. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his eyes, bright blue as the summer sky, radiated unwavering determination. Richard's heart skipped a beat as he recognized those eyes. "Impossible," he muttered, feeling the blood drain from his face. The young man stopped at the opposite end of the table, directly across from Richard. Their eyes met across the polished surface, and in that moment, everyone else in the room seemed to disappear. "Ladies and gentlemen," the young man began, his voice strong and clear despite his congenital deafness. Years of specialized therapy and rigorous training had enabled him to overcome this barrier. I am Nathan Summers, the new CEO of Montgomery Construction. Effective today, the company will be renamed Summers Innovations. Richard looked at him, not believing his eyes and ears. You? How did you? Nathan interrupted him. Mr. Montgomery, you don't need to know this. I'm here to make an important announcement. He turned to the rest of the group, but his words were clearly directed at Richard. Richard Montgomery, you are officially dismissed from Montgomery Construction, now Summers Innovations, effective immediately. Your stock has been purchased by our investment group. The atmosphere in the room froze. Richard turned pale, feeling the ground slipping from under his feet. You can't do this. This is my company, he shouted, losing his composure. Nathan stepped closer, his eyes glittering with suppressed emotion. This company doesn't belong to you, Mr. Montgomery. It belongs to the people who worked so hard to build it, the people you used and betrayed for your own gain. I'm simply returning it to where it belongs. The other shareholders were silent, but their looks made it clear that they were on Nathan's side. No one stood up for Richard, the man they had once feared and respected. Richard took a step forward. Listen to me, sir. He stopped. The word son caught in his throat. Don't call me that, Nathan snapped coldly. You gave up that right 15 years ago when you abandoned me at the orphanage. Don't pretend there's any connection between us. Richard stepped back as if he had been physically struck. The image of the small child who had once reached out to him was now transformed into the image of a confident young man standing before him. A man he had never known and now might never know. Nathan turned to Victor, who had been watching the scene with obvious pleasure the whole time. Mr. Harris, your services are also no longer required. You are dismissed with immediate effect. The smile disappeared from Victor's face. What? You can't do that. I've served this company for years. I don't need your excuses, Nathan snapped. Get out before I call security. Victor stood motionless, his face twisted in shock and rage. Finally, he turned and hurried out of the room, casting a look of hatred at Richard. Richard could not bring himself to meet his eyes, feeling the collapse of his empire complete before his eyes. Nathan returned to the table and continued the meeting, presenting his plan to revive the company, restructure debt, and restore customer trust. He was clear, knowledgeable, full of energy and vision, all the qualities that had once characterized Richard himself. Richard sat, not listening to the details, lost in his own thoughts. He saw himself in Nathan, a younger, more ambitious version of himself, but without the cruelty and ruthlessness he had cultivated over the years. When the meeting ended, Richard remained seated while everyone else left. Nathan collected his papers, ignoring his presence. Nathan, Richard called quietly. The young man looked up, and there was no warmth or forgiveness in his eyes, only cold businesslikeness. You'd better leave, Mr. Montgomery. This is no longer your place. Richard stood up, his legs feeling like lead. I just want to know, how did you survive? How did you end up here? Nathan looked at him for a long moment before answering. I had talent that you didn't bother to see, and there were people who, unlike you, believed in me. The rest is the result of my work and determination. Richard nodded, at a loss for words. He walked slowly toward the exit, each step laborious, as if he were carrying the weight of a collapsing world on his shoulders. At the last moment he turned around. She would be proud of you, your mother. Nathan didn't answer, but something flickered in his eyes, a shadow of an emotion Richard couldn't recognize. Richard walked out of the boardroom, and the heavy doors closed behind him with a final loud click, cutting him off from his old life. In the long hallway, he saw his reflection in a large mirror, an old, tired man with slumped shoulders and a dull look, a man betrayed by his own son, whom he had once rejected. Richard returned to his empty office to gather his personal belongings. The room that had once been a symbol of his power now felt empty and foreign. On his desk was a formal notice from Nathan, not only terminating his employment, but also demanding a public apology to all employees for the management's failures. Never, Richard muttered, crumpling the paper. He had never apologized to anyone in his life, and to begin now seemed an unthinkable humiliation. However, further reading of the document made him change his mind. If he refused, all his remaining assets related to the company would be immediately frozen, and a series of lawsuits would be initiated against him on behalf of the affected clients and partners. The room fell silent, broken only by the ticking of the antique clock on the wall, a gift from the board of directors for the company's 10th anniversary. The irony was not lost on Richard. Martha, his devoted housekeeper, called, worried about his long absence. "Mr. Montgomery, are you all right? You didn't show up for dinner." A puzzled Richard replied in a lifeless tone. "It's all over, Martha. My own son, whom I abandoned, has come back and taken everything from me." Martha paused for a second before answering. "Perhaps this is a sign, sir? A chance to make amends for the past?" Richard picked up his cold coffee, his hands shaking. "Fix it? How do you fix 25 years of absence? He hates me, Martha, and he has every right to." "It's never too late to make the first move, sir," Martha replied quietly before hanging up. The next day, Richard Montgomery walked into the company's large conference room where hundreds of employees were gathered. All eyes were on him, but none of them showed the same respect. Only disappointment, anger, and contempt. Nathan stood at the podium, his imposing figure looming over the corporate logo, now redesigned without the Montgomery name. As Richard stepped onto the platform, Nathan looked at him without the slightest sign of compassion. "Is there something you would like to say to your former employees, Mr. Montgomery?" Nathan asked, his voice cold and formal. Richard walked up to the microphone, clutching it tightly in his hand. He looked at the audience and felt his knees go weak with fear and humiliation. All his life, he had been the one controlling others, making them feel small and insignificant. Now he found himself in that role. I want to apologize," he began, his voice shaking. There was absolute silence in the room. Some of the employees exchanged surprised glances, not believing that they were actually hearing these words from a man who had always been synonymous with arrogance and ruthlessness. "I made unforgivable mistakes. I allowed greed and pride to cloud my judgment. Not only did I hurt the company, but I let down all of you, the people who trusted me with their careers and their futures." Richard paused, his voice growing quieter. "But my mistakes began long before the company's problems. 25 years ago, I abandoned my only son, convincing myself that he would be a liability because he was deaf. I wasn't just wrong, I was a monster." A murmur ran through the room. Many people didn't know this part of Richard's story, and the revelation shocked even those who thought they knew him well. Richard continued, not looking at Nathan. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know that some things are unforgivable. I just want you to know that I fully understand the extent of my mistakes and the consequences of my actions." When he finished, no one applauded. No one said a word. But the silence itself made Richard's humiliation more palpable than any verbal attack. He slowly walked away from the microphone, feeling the weight of the years and mistakes he had made weighing on his shoulders. At that moment, Nathan approached him and quietly said, "You are free to go. Security will escort you to the exit." Richard nodded, unable to find the strength to protest or to take pride any longer. As he headed for the door, followed by two guards, the staff parted like water before him. No one wanted to be near a fallen titan whose empire was crumbling before their eyes. Outside the building, Richard paused and took one last look at the skyscraper that once bore his name. The sun reflected off its glass windows, blinding his eyes as if the building itself was rejecting him. He walked slowly to the parking lot where his driver was waiting for him, the last remaining symbol of the former luxury that he would soon have to give up. At home, Richard found that he could not stay in the luxurious mansion, which now seemed like a museum of bad decisions and missed opportunities. Within days, he sold most of his possessions and moved to a small, modest house on the outskirts of town where no one knew him. Martha, although she wanted to stay to take care of him, was refused. "You need to live for yourself, Martha. Don't waste your time on someone like me," he told her, insisting that she accept a generous severance package. The new house was modest, even austere, compared to what Richard had become accustomed to. But to him, it was all he now deserved, perhaps more. He began to do the daily chores that had previously seemed unworthy of his attention, from cleaning to cooking, from doing laundry to tending the small garden behind the house. Richard spent his days sitting on a simple wooden chair on the porch, looking out onto the street where the neighbors' children played, and thinking about his own life. Images kept flashing before his eyes. Sarah, his long-dead wife, Nathan, the son he had cruelly abandoned, and himself, a man so blinded by ambition that he had lost everything that really mattered. One evening, as he watched the sunset from his porch, he was overcome with such a strong sense of remorse and regret that he could not hold back his tears. For the first time in years, Richard Montgomery cried, allowing himself to fully feel the pain of his mistakes. "Sarah, I'm so sorry," he whispered, looking up at the sky, which was painted in shades of pink and gold. I failed you. I failed our son. At that moment, the image of a lonely man with graying hair and a face tormented by years of greed and subsequent remorse closed this chapter of his life. One question constantly sounded in his head. Is there still a chance for redemption, or have I lost everything forever? It had been almost a year since Richard Montgomery had lost his company and started a new life in a modest house on the outskirts of New York City. Each day he followed a simple routine, rising at dawn, eating oatmeal he had learned to cook himself, working in a small garden behind the house, and spending his evenings reading books he had never found time to read in his previous life. Although his days were filled with simple tasks, each day Richard felt an emptiness inside that neither gardening nor reading could fill. It was an emptiness left by the loss of the family he had destroyed through his own decisions. One autumn morning, as he was drinking tea at his small kitchen table, the doorbell rang. Richard was surprised. He rarely had visitors. When he opened the door, he saw Martha, his former housekeeper, holding a small parcel. "Martha, what are you doing here?" Richard asked, unusually pleased to see a familiar face. "Good morning, Mr. Montgomery," Martha smiled. "I received this in your old mailbox. The sender asked me to deliver it personally." She handed him a small box wrapped in plain brown paper. Richard took the package, feeling his heart begin to beat faster as he recognized the neat, clear handwriting on the package. It was Nathan's. "Thank you, Martha. Would you like to come in for tea?" Richard suggested. "Not today, sir. I have much to do. But I am glad to see that you look well." She smiled sincerely, noticing that Richard had indeed changed. He had lost weight, his features had softened, and there was something new in his eyes, some depth that had not been there before. After Martha left, Richard returned to the table and carefully, almost reverently, unwrapped the package. Inside, he found a painting in a simple wooden frame and an envelope. The painting was a work of art. It showed a boy standing in the middle of an autumn forest, with a soft light filtering through the leaves and illuminating his face. Despite the loneliness around him, the boy's face did not express fear or sadness, but calm determination and hope. At the bottom was the artist's signature, simply N, and one word, hope. Richard looked at the painting for a long time, feeling something inside him shaking and breaking. Then he picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside was a short letter. "Richard, I have been thinking a lot during this time. We may not be able to change the past, but I believe that everyone deserves a second chance. This is one of my first works. I painted it in the shelter after a particularly hard day. It reflected my feelings then, and in a strange way, my feelings now.